The history of land speed racing in the 20th century is filled with amazing creations of all shapes, sizes, and with all methods of propulsion. Big piston engines, small piston engines, wheel-driven with turbine engines, thrust-propelled with turbine engines, of course, and more wildly awesome than that, thrust-propelled by rockets. And that's what we're here to talk about today, the weird and wacky story of Walter Arfons' Wingfoot Express 2 and the history of rocket cars, starting in the 1920s and leading to the big blue beast attempting to set the world's land speed record in 1965. It's a story of brilliant people, brave people, two brothers who weren't on speaking terms, parachutists falling from the sky, and a machine without compare in the annals of land speed racing. The fun of the Wingfoot 2 story is understanding the origins of rocket-propelled cars and how they managed to very quickly capture the imagination of the public in the late 1920s. Our story begins in 1920s Germany. Fritz von Opel is operating his family business, the massive Opel brand of automobiles, and he's known as a man with a taste for adventure and thrill-seeking. In 1928, von Opel was approached by Max Valier, a leading engineer and rocket enthusiast in Germany, who had the idea of building some rocket cars and even a rocket plane to get the public excited about the technology, as well as potentially setting some records along the way. Into the idea, they contacted a third man, Frederick Sander. Sander was already in the business of making rockets and pyrotechnics. In fact, his signal rockets and line-throwing rockets were used around the world by sailors and boaters to save themselves and others if they were ever in great distress and needed help. The three of them worked quickly and decided that their first project should be a rocket-powered car. It was an Opel named Rack 1, short for the German words for rocket car. Using a rectangular arrangement of 12 small rockets, the machine was brought to the Opel factory test track for a private test session. On April 11, 1928, the car accelerated from 0 to 62 miles an hour in a mere 8 seconds. Well, mere for the time. This was a revelation to many people. It spawned the talk of rockets taking people to the moon, flying them across the Atlantic in hours, and in the typical futuristic hopes and dreams of the day, it caused people to geek out after the small success of a much larger idea. Now, not satisfied to keep all this fun to themselves, von Opel, Valier, and Sander literally doubled down, building the Rack 2, making the car totally aerodynamic, adding stabilizer wings, and placing 24 rockets in the rear of the automobile and 256 pounds of propellants in them to do the work. The car was designed to surpass speeds of 125 miles an hour, but there was no knowledge or idea of how fast it would actually go. Wanting to keep the public interest, the car was not run on the private company track, but rather the famed AVU circuit, and the public was invited. Thousands came to watch the spectacle. The car was brought out under a tarp and then revealed, explained, and readied for its blast. All this about 3 weeks since the first version of the car actually ran. In a massive plume of smoke, with a whoosh and scream the crowd had never heard, the Opel was off. The car did not fire all 24 rockets at once. They were fired electronically in batches of 4 every time von Opel stepped down on the button that was on the floor of the car. Stomping on that button several times, the car went from 0 to 148 miles an hour faster than anything on Earth ever had. The crowd went bonkers. Von Opel was a hero, and at virtually the same second he came to a stop, he decided rockets on the ground were cool, but rocket-powered flight would be his next conquest. Now, we're going to leave von Opel and his rocket here because we're just getting started, but the next stop, rocket-powered fun on American dirt tracks in 1932. Sig Hugdahl was America's best dirt track racer in the late 1920s and early 30s. A champion 6 years straight, he was living the American dream. He had come to the U.S. from Norway with exceptional mechanical ability, guts for days, and according to lots of reports, an innate knowledge of pyrotechnics. In 1922, he was reported to have driven the Wisconsin Special with its 836 cubic inch engine to speeds in excess of 180 miles an hour on the sands of Daytona Beach. Timed by the International Motor Contest Association, instead of the Automobile Club of America, the leading sanctioning body at the time, the record was never observed, but we go back to 1932. Hugdahl never gave a definitive reason for creating his rocket car, but if I had to guess, it was rooted in practicality. Most of the racing he did during the summer happened at big state fairs. Sprint car racing was always a featured attraction. Well, if you won, which he often did, the money was good, and if you didn't, not so much. But what if he built an exhibition car that would get him paid every place he went, make it unique, put on a show, and leave with the dough from every single event? And this is exactly what he did. Having experimented with some rudimentary rockets attached to a car on Daytona Beach, And when I say rudimentary, they were hand-lit with a blowtorch. His new creation was a big step forward. Using a total of 32 tubular steel holsters, 20 in a cross shape on the tail of the car and 6 on either side, Hugdahl took a pretty typical Miller race car of the day and made it into the type of thing that people, even in Depression-era America, wanted to pay to see. The car carried no engine, no transmission, or other means of propulsion. With rockets and SIG in the seat, it weighed 1,550 pounds. Other details? Unfortunately, the extensive news reporting on the car of the day was a lot more about promoting its appearance and revolutionary nature than they were as to explaining its inner workings. Now, the good news is that they, like all rockets, were comparatively simple. In fact, they were just like Von Opel's. A switch on the dash could be set to fire a few different numbers of rockets at the same time, and depending on the distance he was traveling, he'd set it, and each time he stepped on the floor-mounted button, another group would fire. Now, how fast was it? About 55 miles an hour was the most the car would see in terms of speed, and as far as duration goes, it seemed like various reports that the car would make a couple of laps at a typical state fair dirt track before petering out. It was a good act for a large part of the summer, and then August 15th, 1932 happened. If you're wondering, like I often did while doing this research, how he kept getting his rocket fuel refilled or where the solid fuel rockets were coming from to power the car, you don't have to anymore. These were liquid-fueled rockets. Now, whatever witch's brew the fuel was, he carried it with him and refueled his own rockets between shows or races. Unfortunately, on August 15th at the Mississippi Valley Fairgrounds during a performance, the car exploded with terrific fury and basically blew the back off of itself. A spontaneous ignition of all the rockets in an uncontrolled fashion led Hugdahl with a mangled car, a bruised back, and really short time to fix it. But amazingly, he did. By the 19th of August, he was already back in the papers, proclaiming he would drive the car in 2 weeks at the Minnesota State Fair and run it to 75 miles per hour in the process. While never fast by modern standards, the car did typically run within a second of the lap times being turned by the traditional sprint cars of the day, albeit by itself and trailing incredible amounts of smoke. Hugdahl was also racing a traditional sprint car that year, and he won his 6th straight national IMCA title and parked the exhibition car at the end of the 1932 season, hung up his driving gloves at the end of 1934, and closed his career promoting a stock car race on the Daytona Beach sand with a local gas station owner named Bill France in 1937. I wonder if anything ever came of that. Later in the 1930s, the war came, and rocket cars were replaced with V-2 rockets landing on innocent civilians in London, and the world's attention was turned to fighting and developing weaponry to win a conflict that had swallowed the entire globe. As was the case in so much of gearhead life, the advancements and developments during this time period would have immediate crossover after the war. The next step in this story of rocket cars comes in 1946 at the Indianapolis Motor Speedway, and it comes because of a tire company that just so happened to own a rocket company. No kidding. Enter Duke Neylan, General Tire and Rubber, and Aerojet. Neylan was a pretty good, high-profile, nationally known race car driver, and people sure knew the General Tire and Rubber Corporation, but what was Aerojet, and what the heck was a JATO rocket? For starters, a JATO is a misnomer. JATO stands for Jet Assisted Takeoff, and it should really always be called a RATO for Rocket Assisted Takeoff. That being said, I'm going to refer to them as JATOs for the rest of this video because it's a term most people have heard. Now, what are they? Basically small auxiliary rockets. They are attached to airplanes to help them get off the ground on shorter runways, and in a war, when a runway is blown to bits and shortened, or when planes are loaded to within a breath of their max capacity, any help they can get to become airborne is welcome, and this is where these rockets came into play. In the 1920s and 30s, Germans and Russians worked to develop their versions of this technology for a variety of different planes and applications. The United States government first invested a princely $1,000 in 1939 to start the developmental process at the Guggenheim Aeronautical Lab, which was at Caltech. Theodore von Karman led the project and was surrounded by a group of talented engineers, and by 1941, they had developed compact units that passed testing. These units assisted an airplane in a traditional takeoff, and then they actually propelled the plane into the sky with nothing but their own rocket power. On August 16th, with the success of that test, the Aerojet Company was born, and those Caltech engineers were in business, and what a business it was. The military was ordering thousands of rockets at a time. The number of employees swelled from half a dozen to hundreds, and eventually tens of thousands seemingly overnight, but there was a major problem: money. To grow a business in a burgeoning industry like rocketry required loans, and no bank on the planet understood or wanted to fund a rocket company. The founders who had issued themselves stock at the start of the business were in a place where so many others have been. They needed cash flow or their business was going to sink. In 1944, they approached the General Tire and Rubber Company that at least one of the officers of Aerojet had some experience with. At this time, General Tire was diversified in media and other aspects, and so they tried to get the company to invest. And they did. Seeing the potential in the investment and understanding some of the chemical crossover, they bought Aerojet and turned it into part of their own company. With stability and funding from General, Aerojet went R&D crazy. Believe it or not, they were able to use a rubber binding chemical in their solid rocket fuel program, and they struck gold. JATOs were being ordered and manufactured in massive quantity, while other parts of the company continued to advance their studies of other elements of rocketry. Eventually, the company would be considered the largest producer of rockets and propellants in the world. Now this brings us back to Duke Neylan and the 1946 Indianapolis 500. On May 21, 1946, race officials allowed Neylan to take his General Tire-sponsored car onto the course by itself and run a few experimental laps. The car was as it would be raced in the Indy 500, with the exception of two small Aerojet JATO rockets mounted to either side of the rear axle. The plan was to exit turn 2 and fire the rockets to see just how much speed boost the car would receive and then gauge its performance from that. Some figured the car would double its power and acceleration. Some said it would explode, and Neylan was in for it. The result was far less spectacular, a measly 20-mile-an-hour increase from the 41-pound-apiece rockets and just a lot of smoke behind the car. He refreshed the solid fuel rockets twice more that day, and the results remained the same. Unimpressive. It wasn't a dud, but it was wimpy enough to stop Neylan's planned exhibition tour over the summer for lack of entertainment value and speed. He had bragged about a 50-stop tour and then a stop at the Bonneville Salt Flats to set speed records. Neylan qualified on the last row of the 1946 field, sans rockets, and finished 22nd. Neylan's mention of a 50-stop tour in Bonneville Salt Flats was interesting. After all, Neylan was a racer, and at this time these guys were racing seemingly on the daily, so how did he of all people have the time to plan all this out? The answer is that he didn't, but somebody else did. Al Sweeney, the operator of National Speedways, Inc., and one of the largest racing promoters in the nation. Operating primarily on the State Fair dirt track circuit, he remembered the draw of Sig Huglin's car while working for Alex Sloan back in the day, who was one of the greatest race promoters of all time. He knew that a rocket car would draw as an exhibition act. When Neylan's car flopped, he knew he needed something, and as a Chicago area guy, he knew just who he should go to. The Granatelli brothers. Inveterate entrepreneurs, showmen, and inventors, they had started the Grand Corps Speed Parts Company in 1945, and these guys were long known as a group capable of creating anything and doing it with style. Al Sweeney approached them with a deal. They built a rocket car for exhibitions at his fair races, and he'd pay them enough to make the whole thing worthwhile, and if they could have it ready yesterday, that would be great too. Acting fast, the guys bought the former Don Hulbert Special. This was a 1934 Ford-based racer that had attempted to qualify for the Indy 500 about a decade before. They carved an opening in the massive back of the car, placed 8 rockets in a cluster, and the Grand Corps rocket was born. Driven by Antonio the Great Granatelli, a man a couple decades before his STP fortune, the machine made a lot of smoke, went 108 miles an hour at Nashville Speedway, and was basically run ragged through the summer of 1946. A fun promotional attraction, it wasn't exactly what the people were expecting when they plunked down their money to see it. Now that said, Sweeney and the Granatelli boys all made out well. The car does still exist today and has been driven in events like the Great Race and others, but the rockets have never been fired again. Now at this point we introduce the main protagonist of our story, Walter Arfons, the half-brother of Art, and for roughly a decade in the 1950s, the two men raced, built, engineered, and dominated together. Their series of Green Monster Allison-powered drag racing cars owned strip and national records from coast to coast, made them more money than two farm boys who ran a feed, grain, and hardware store in Akron could have ever dreamed of, and then seemingly everything changed on a dime in about 1960. The true reasons will never be known for the split in their brothers' relationship, but it was seemingly immediate and definitely permanent. Perhaps it was something Walter did in 1960 that changed the game. He invented and debuted the world's first jet dragster. In fact, it was the first jet-powered land vehicle that didn't use railroad tracks in history. It was Green Monster 16, and despite the fact that it was initially very slow, barely cracking 120 miles an hour in the quarter mile, it didn't take long to become the most in-demand drag strip attraction in the nation. Now that had to have bugged Art, or it sure seems like it did. As I've documented in another video on this channel linked here, Art stuck with pistons and made his famed Anteater, first showing up at the Bonneville Salt Flats in 1960. By 1962, Art was apparently tired of Walt getting the headlines and the money with his jet green monster, so he built the Cyclops jet dragster of his own and took it to not only seemingly every drag strip in the country, but also to the Bonneville Salt Flats. The ace up Art's sleeve was the massive General Electric J79 turbine engine that was purchased, at the embarrassment of the federal government, at a Florida military scrapyard. His car ran 342 miles an hour in 1962, and while that wasn't the outright speed record, it was, and still is, the fastest open cockpit car in Bonneville history. Art had his own ideas on how he would improve his program in 1963, and Walt? He too had gotten salt fever, and it started in a conversation at a trade show in late 1962. Tom Green was a chief engineer at the PA Sturdivant Company, a manufacturer of torque wrenches. In conversation with Arfons, the talk quickly turned to the land speed record, Tom Green's interest in studying aerodynamics, and how the two of them could likely build a vehicle to smash the existing record to pieces given some budget and time. Within days, the men were advancing on their plan. A model was created, a Westinghouse J46 engine was bought for less than $1,000, and Walt got his welder going. Tom Green was in charge of fabricating the entire body, its unique nose and the rest of the covering over the engine as well. Along the way, they pitched Goodyear tire executives into backing the project. Goodyear did already have a sponsorship deal in place with Craig Breedlove for big money, but these guys had a convincing pitch. Green and Arfons used math to show the dozen or so executives the relative limits of the other cars trying to grab the record, and when they left the meeting, they had about $50,000 promised to them for their efforts. Now, this was a pittance compared to everybody else, but they'd take it, and the Wingfoot Express was born. By May of 1963, the car was finished and in operable condition for testing. About 30 feet long, 2,800 pounds, 6 feet tall at the top of the wing, and more than 12 feet wide at the rear, it was largely cylindrical outside of the cockpit and front fairing that Green had designed with his own aerodynamic theories. Newspapers heralded the creation of the car and announced it would be tested at Detroit Dragway on the last weekend of the month. Walt Arfons was going to drive the car at Bonneville, but he wanted to observe how it looked from the outside at the drag strip, so he had one of his jet drivers, Chuck Hatcher, pilot it for the test. Hatcher was experienced and trusted by Walt because he had toured around the country with the Green Monster already. The first 2 slow runs, the car was fine. The third run was a complete disaster. Launching off and rocketing down the strip, upon reaching the finish line, the car, heavy as it was and traveling well over 200 miles per hour, lost the parachutes, melted the brakes, and shot off the end of the track, through a wall, across a street, and into a wooded ravine, dragging along with it hundreds of feet of metal fencing. Hatcher was okay, the car wasn't too badly hurt, but the body Tom Green had made was wrecked. Oh, adding to the issue, Walt Arfons had suffered a heart attack standing on the starting line watching this calamity take place. With Bonneville looming, he'd be laid up in the hospital, the doctors told him he'd never drive his creations again, and Tom Green had scant little time to fix the body. Undaunted, Green worked day and night to build another body as Arfons recovered and fixed the chassis. In July of 1963, Green, Arfons, Hatcher, and Doug Rose all traveled to Utah in search of the ultimate glory, the world's land speed record. Tom Green got the surprise of his life when they arrived. He was named the driver. Despite having Hatcher and Rose, 2 experienced jet pilots on hand, and despite the fact he had never personally driven more than 130 miles an hour, Tom Green would attempt to take the world's land speed record on the Bonneville Salt Flats. Using the first couple of days to make slow runs in the 200-mile-an-hour range, Green worked up his skills and nerve to really get after it on July 24, 1963. It went horribly. The design of the car was allowing the engine to swallow salt. The salt was building up on the fan blades inside the engine, causing massive vibration and loss of power. Barely cracking 300 miles per hour, not using the afterburner, and going successively slower and slower with each additional run, the newspapers had a field day with the effort. The next day, the team decided they had to replace the engine, admitted a humiliating defeat, but then something else happened. Doug Rose, who would go on to be the driver of the legendary Green Mamba jet dragster for decades, decided to go sky skiing. This is basically what we would now call parasailing. Pulled behind a car and floating some 50 to 60 feet in the air, all of a sudden his parachute collapsed, sending him into the ground like a falling rock. Rose's back was fractured, his heel was broken, and once again, the Wingfoot Express was a laughingstock. Shortly after the defeated group left the salt, Craig Breedlove would push the land speed record up over 400 miles per hour for the first time in his Spirit of America jet car, and they'd have a year to make the necessary changes. The Wingfoot Express was a darling of the car show circuit all that winter. Drag strip testing in the spring allowed various bugs to be sorted out, and the car was ready for its redemption come late 1964 in September, except it wasn't. Initial runs of 309 miles an hour were promising, but then the car began to once again slow down on successive passes. The good news was the team was more experienced than they were in 1963. They had brought a spare engine. Arfons and the guys took a couple of days to replace their lazy J34 with a fresh unit. Now, with better speeds, they were still shy of the record, even with Green using the afterburner on the engine more than he ever had. So what was wrong? One man in the crowd knew, and he waited until almost the bitter end of Saturday, October 3rd, 1964, to tell Walt Arfons. It was his half-brother and blood rival, Art. In a moment that proves blood is thicker than water, Art recommended an adjustment to the jet's fuel system and to further open up the diameter of the clamshell at the rear of the engine, going from a 17-inch diameter opening to about 19 inches and 1/16th of a turn on the engine's fuel enrichment. The car went 406.55 miles an hour on its first of two record runs. Craig Breedlove's mark of 407.65 miles an hour from the year before seemed within grasp. On the return run, Tom Green let the Wingfoot Express give all it had to give, and the car ran 420.07 miles per hour, establishing a new world record of 413.2. This instantly created heroes out of Tom Green, Walt Arfons, and the Wingfoot Express. The news was reported worldwide for 2 days. On October 5, 1964, Art Arfons ran 479 miles per hour one way and 396 miles per hour the other to reset the land speed record at 434.02 miles an hour. This decimated the mark of the Wingfoot Express in a fashion bordering on humiliation. Craig Breedlove would answer Art Arfons, and Art would answer him back through the end of 1964, pushing the record higher and higher, but Walt Arfons wasn't done yet. See, Walt had an ace up his sleeve and a way to make the Wingfoot faster by a whole lot and very quickly. He was going to add rockets. JATO rockets. Hauling the car back to the salt in November, the Wingfoot Express now had auxiliary rocket power in the form of 3 Aerojet 15 KS-1000 JATO rockets. Designed to burn for 15 seconds and produce 1,000 pounds of thrust while doing it, these solid fuel boosters would be the ace in the hole for their pluggy effort. Now, he also brought with him a new driver, Bobby Tatro. Tom Green had gotten his fill of speed at 420 miles an hour, and he did not crave any more. Tatro was fearless and the right man for this job. But the question remains, how did Walt get his hands on these rocket canisters? It seems there may have been some hot rodders on the inside at Aerojet. These rockets used an electric glow plug to ignite black powder, which would then ignite the solid fuel rocket, and once they were lit, they'd burn for 15 seconds whether you wanted to or not. These rockets, with their solid propellant, were very safe to handle and resistant to things like rough handling or even thermal shock. The team now waited at Bonneville for a set of new Goodyear tires rated to 650 miles an hour, and as they did, the blustery weather of the high-altitude salt flats began to turn against them. Intermittent rain and even sleet were falling. Receiving the tires on Tuesday, they were installed immediately, and then it snowed. The Wingfoot was parked, but Walt had showed up with 2 cars. He brought the Wingfoot, and his Avenger jet dragster was on hand for another purpose. Paula Murphy, the pioneering female racer who had run 161 at the flats the year before, was going to break the female land speed record, and wet salt, snow, and other people's objections were not going to stop her. Murphy set a two-way record of 226.37 miles per hour, skipping across the wet salt flats in the jet dragster like a thrust-powered stone. Paula Murphy was absolutely the bravest person in the state of Utah that day. Another man was with Tatro and Arfons that week, and his name was John Cole. He was far more than just an interested observer of the whole process. Cole was a rocket propulsion engineer with Aerojet, the company that made the JATO rockets Walt had mounted on the Wingfoot Express. Beyond simply being there, Cole seemed to know something the rest of the world didn't. Rockets were about to become a big story at Bonneville. John Cole had the inside line on a car that Walter Arfons would build, Bobby Tatro would drive. They would all be created in secret, fabricated in a little shop on Pickle Road in Akron, a few hundred scant feet from that of Art Arfons' own. Walter Arfons teased the world in January 1965 with a single sketch of a car that he planned to build to shatter not only the standing land speed record, which was now 536 miles per hour, but also break the sound barrier while doing it. Unbeknownst to anyone, Arfons had been working secretly with Alex Tremulous, the famed car designer, who had tried to put together a design study on a combined jet and rocket-powered entry in the late 40s for Ab Jenkins. As Tremulous and Jenkins could not get a turbine engine for the project at that point, it went nowhere. But this one would. Working in secret at his shop, Arfons began to construct the Wingfoot Express 2, which would be Bonneville's first purely rocket-powered entry to the land speed record war. As the machine came together, the few people who'd see it would ask various design and engineering questions, resulting in Walter adding more steel, more bracing, more gussets, and more bars, all while adding more and more weight. Goodyear stepped up with more money, and their defense division designed and made the thick protective driver canopy, as well as the massive aerodynamic wheel coverings at the Wingfoot's rear. Shaped like a giant cone laying on its side, the machine had two wheels placed very close together in the front, and the rears were spread some 13 feet apart. 29 feet long, 9 feet tall, and weighing somewhere near 4,000 pounds before a single rocket was added, it was beastly. Speaking of those rockets, 15 Aerojet 15 KS-1000 units would be mounted in a huge rack at the vehicle's rear. Roughly 3 feet long, 10 inches in diameter, and weighing 144 pounds before firing, the rockets would add another ton of weight to the vehicle when fully loaded. The first appearance of the car in any sort of news came long before its public debut. Going to the Salt Flats secretly in July of 1965, the rocket-powered monster would run an increasing number of engines to work out the timing and firing of the blasters in sequence. All 15 rockets wouldn't be fired at once, but like the days of Von Opel, they'd be fired several at a time by the command of driver Bobby Tatro. The fastest run the vehicle made with 10 rockets fired in sequence was 300 miles per hour that July. The public would first see the Wingfoot Express in newspaper stories that were released in September of 1965. Testing with just 2 JATOs at the Akron airport to display the machine under power, it was a stunning beast. Even Alex Tremulous was there to observe the thing at the airport. Arfons bought 50 JATO rockets for the published price of $36,000. How did he get them? No longer classified military equipment, by 1965, JATOs were being tested for use on commercial aircraft and even more public applications. After all, Aerojet had produced 236,000 of them, and as the power level of turbine engines on aircraft got ever more significant, JATOs became less and less needed. The military had such a glut of these things that they began doing studies in the early 60s to see how long they could sit on a shelf being unused before they degraded on performance and reliability. The shelf life was determined to be at least 10 years. Undoubtedly, Walt got some sort of a deal on the 50 he bought, but this was still a major expense. On September 21st, the crew was on the Salt Flats, and all they saw was a sea of white slush. The weather had soaked the salt, and they were once again in a waiting game, much as they were at the end of 1964. Days later, the car ran 290 miles an hour on 7 of the 10 rockets loaded into the car. Was this promising? It didn't feel like it, nor should it have. On the 23rd, Arfons announced plans to let the car loose with all 15 rockets and make a real record attempt. His confidence level was clearly shaky when answering a reporter's expectation question with the answer of, quote, "We'll just have to see what happens," end quote. What happened was not what they wanted by a long shot. A measly average of 247 miles an hour over 2 runs was all they got out of the car using the 15 rockets. Tatro indicated that his airspeed gauge had read a peak of 485 miles an hour at one point before the burn ended and the car coasted to a speed of 406 through the end of the time mile. The fatal flaw in this idea had been exposed, but there was no quit in Walt Arfons. He had a backup plan, and he instituted it. The plan? More rockets. Dragging the car into a hangar at Wendover Air Force Base, the team added 10 more JATO rockets, 5 on each side of the body. The increased thrust, now up to some 25,000 pounds, as well as the ability to stage the rocket burns out for a longer period of time, would deliver them what they needed. On October 19th, they tried again, and it was perhaps their biggest disaster yet. When Tatro launched off and was streaking down the salt, he began firing the rockets in the sequence and timing that Arfons and the Aerojet engineers had come up with, but something was very wrong with the wiring. Suddenly, some of the rockets fired from the wrong end, shooting fire forward. Some of them fired out the side of their bottles, releasing fire through the body, and the car was described as looking like a flaming comet with fire coming out of it in all directions. The machine ran 438 miles an hour in this wild state, and when Tatro finally emerged shaken, he could hardly believe what he saw. The wiring and lots of the body were cooked. Some sections literally melted away, others disconfigured beyond words. Beyond the retro end of the rockets firing, the biggest issue was the burn time. No matter how he staged the rockets out, Tatro didn't have enough time with only 15 seconds per stage to maintain acceleration through the time mile. The car was so massively heavy that the initial acceleration was so slow that by the time it made it to the measured mile, it was virtually out of fuel. Surveying his dwindling supply of JATO rockets, Arfons directed his team back to the Wendover hangar. They rewired the car, fixed the body, and loaded it once more with 25 rockets, which they took to the course on October 23rd. This time, everything worked as it was supposed to. The car was a blur as it gained speed more and more across the salt. It entered the measured mile, and suddenly the fire was out. The rockets were off, but it had been their best run. Tatro swore up and down that he saw 580 miles an hour on his airspeed indicator. After coming to a stop, the team met him in the shutdown area, jubilant. Now, while the car was far short of the sound barrier, they had finally done what they dreamed the car could do. At least it looked like it. And then they were approached by Joe Petrali, the chief timing officer at Bonneville. Their clock speed was only 476 miles an hour in the measured mile, nearly 70 miles per hour short of the record. Crestfallen, Arfons told the team that they were done, the effort was over, and that they'd head back to Ohio and figure out how to make the car faster. Clearly, the car was traveling more than 500 miles per hour, likely far more than 500 miles per hour at some point, but when the rocket stopped, the car's extreme weight and the aerodynamic drag slowed it drastically. To still achieve a speed of 476 miles an hour, coasting is astonishing, but still a failure at 476 miles per hour. The Wingfoot Express 2 never came back to the salt. It was never seen in public again, and it's widely believed that Walter Arfons cut the machine into pieces and scrapped it. There's no evidence to suggest anything differently. That year, the record would go to 576 miles per hour and then over 600 miles per hour as Art and Craig Breedlove waged the most epic speed war of all time in a moment that will never be repeated. Craig Breedlove would set the record at an official 600.6 miles per hour that year. Art would suffer the highest speed car wreck in human history and live, destroying his Green Monster at over 550 miles per hour or better. The land speed record would stand for 5 years until the Blue Flame Special with Gary Gablich behind the wheel would run 622.407 miles per hour in 1970, using, ironically, rocket power to take the mark. Sure, it was a liquid rocket, but still, it has to make you smirk. Walter Arfons would live to be 96 years old. He died in 2013 from complications of pneumonia. He fielded his fleet of jet cars with various drivers into the 1970s before retiring to Bradenton, Florida, and then living his last years in his hometown of Akron, Ohio. Walter Arfons' legacy is an interesting one. Some see it as sad. I see it as pretty amazing. He and Art owned the sport of drag racing for years on end in terms of performance and popularity. He built the first jet dragster, a preposterous idea crafted in the Arfons way with no money and raw skill. His brief capture of the world's land speed record was a triumph of guts and will. His construction of Wingfoot 2 is a jaw-dropping study in one man's perseverance and force of will. I truly believe the car likely went more than 500 miles per hour at some point during its short life on the salt. There's a look back at some wild history of cars, rockets, good ideas and bad. The world's land speed record is once again in the hands of a turbine-powered car, one that broke the sound barrier. Will it ever be broken again? I'm not betting against it. I'm Brian Loans. Thanks for watching. Like and subscribe for more automotive, racing, and gearhead history, piston-powered and otherwise.